So I'm in Los Angeles, California, in the Eagle Rock neighborhood, for people who are familiar with Los Angeles. And I was born in Shawnee, Oklahoma, and that was in 1933. My birthday is October 9th. Couple of days, I'll be 88 years of age.
Tell us a little about your life before you got involved in women's health and the women's movement.
My early life, of course, involved being a Okie. My parents moved out to California when I was a baby. And then over the years, they moved back for periods of time, sometimes long enough to, live in go to school, for a year or two. And then later on, just when my mom had my younger brothers, she would go back. And then when she came back to California, I would stay in Oklahoma to finish out the term or whatever. So I sort of had two, a foot in two places. One was the urban California, and the other was this rural community in Oklahoma.
Now, what was the reason? What was the reason she kept going up and back?
To have her child. In other words, to have it delivered in her mother's home. Nice. So and my cousins also were getting born in there. So at a couple of times, not only was my brother a newborn, but my aunt, had just given birth to my cousin. So it was just the way our family functioned as far as childbirth was concerned. My mom had a doctor. Yes, she was delivered by a family doctor. And he used chloroform at the last minute to kind of give her a little whiff to dull the pain or whatever. But basically, it was a natural childbirth compared to today's births in hospitals. And this was in the home setting.
How many siblings do you have?
I have 3 living brothers, or they were, born alive. One is deceased at this point. But I had a sister that died after about 6 weeks of age. She was a little blue baby, what they now call a blue baby. Today, they can save babies that have this heart problem, but at that time they couldn't. So I was the elder sister, and I used it to my maximum advantage. But of course, I was required to, because my mom, expected me to help out a lot. So I sort of had to be the boss because I had that responsibility too.
But you were able to go to school?
Yes, I was always about a year or so ahead in Oklahoma. Whenever I came back to California, they considered, advancing me, but they didn't, and I'm glad, because I was very young considering my peers. My birthday fell such that I was one of the younger, and I was very short. I was really very tiny little kid. In my adolescence, I caught up and I just became the average height. But throughout my childhood, I was very small. My family were not politically active. My grandmother's side of the family were Republicans, I think. Yeah, they were Republicans. They had a business college in this small town near where we lived. And I know they were, active. My other side of the family were Democrats, and they lived in the little village. And my grandmother was the postmistress there. So I sort of went between those two communities, as a child. And I vastly preferred it. Of course, in Los Angeles, I just was, as a little child, I was just swallowed up in this big city. And, uh, it was not fun. I really, did not have that great a social life in my elementary years, but I was very active, super, super active kid, with my bicycle, etc.
I know you have children. Did you have children before you got involved in the women's movement?
Oh, yes, yes. I not only, got married and had children. I was in my mid 30s when the second wave came along. That doesn't mean I wasn't politically active. Actually, I was. I started out as a Girl Scout leader, and I did that for 10 years with my children, my daughters. And then, I became interested in busing and, racial issues. I became active opposing a local urban renewal project and allied myself and the other people in my community with the people in the Black community, which was being hit from the other side of town, so I was quite active. I got a divorce and then remarried, and my new husband was Chicano. So I became active in the Mexican American Political Association, participated in the marches, and got attacked by the LA sheriffs along with everybody else in the Chicano moratorium. So I had quite a tumultuous experience at that time prior to becoming a feminist. As I did this, I gradually, pulled away from my, women friends that were fellow Girl Scout leaders, and became much more active, in the peace movement and, in social issues. That was in, let's see, I think 69 or 68, excuse me, was the Chicano moratorium. So there was a certain amount of activity in the feminist movement, but it was not in Los Angeles particularly. It was mostly on the East Coast at that time, as I recall. And I heard echoes of it. And I remember that the women at UCLA, the students went out and protested because they didn't have a women's health center, couldn't get, contraceptives. And at that time, I was not too sympathetic to them. I thought, that was very dependent on their part, to expect this to be given this. I had kind of a conservative approach to it. So I would not, many people say, well, I was always a feminist. Well, no, I wasn't always a feminist. I may have been independent and so forth and active, but I was not, I had not yet, experienced sisterhood in the feminist sense of the word. But of course, having 6 children, which is what I had, was four daughters and 2 sons. And then I had lots of experiences that were common with all women at that time, and unfortunately continue today, which is too little money to live on. I was helping my first husband get through college, and I had started college and I went a couple years at UCLA, but I dropped out because I became pregnant and got married. Not an unusual story.
No.
Um, and of course, I immediately invested all of my energies into my husband's career, and that was what one did. But so I didn't think about advancing my own until much later. I would have to say that I was mildly depressed over a period of years, and to the point where I actually sought out counseling, to see if I could be less depressed. I didn't define it as depression at the time, and my counselor never, said the word depression, but that's exactly what was happening to me. And but it was helpful. I found I had a sympathetic counselor, and I think he did help me. And then later, when I became pregnant, and it would have been after separating from my first husband and not even being sure, who the father was at this point, I got, sought out an abortion. And that was not easy to do. I mean, you had to hunt to find an abortionist. And at that time, I was working part-time at a state, state compensation insurance fund, to be precise. And I was working in a large typing pool. And, a lot of the women in my pool were Black. And they had the contact. That's where they referred me, my friends referred me to an abortionist in downtown central Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a medically sound abortion, I believe. However, it was an excruciatingly painful one because no anesthetic could be given. I mean, you had to be able to get up off that table and run out. And then later, in the recuperation process, I found that he told me to call him within a week of the abortion, and I did. And he said, well, now here's what you need to do. He said, just put your finger up there. And he said, feel around, and you're going to find a little cloth strip, a little strip of tape. And you just grab hold of it as best you can and pull it out. Well, I took my children over to my grandma's house and went home and got myself situated in the bathroom to do this. And it took me at least a couple of hours to do this, if not more. Time stood still, really, because it was incredibly painful to take it out, and I could only do an inch or so at a time. I had to just kind of rest and, relax, so I could pull out more of this completely hardened, strip that felt like I was pulling out a razor blade out of, So it was, a very difficult procedure, but it was sound. I recovered, and after I became active in the abortion movement, I realized I probably had one of the better experience. I was treated respectfully. He didn't try to come on to me or, anything like that. He had what was supposedly a nurse. It was a vacant office. There was not a stick of furniture in it, except for the table. And but I think he gave me a good abortion.
Wow.
Uh,
What
and then
year was that?
that was about 1960,
Oh,
61. And yeah, abortion was a long way from being, um, well, completely legal. Um, Wait, let me be sure I got that date right for you. No, that would be about right, 62. Yeah. Um, the reason I'm checking the date in my mind is that in 1967, that was a few years later, um, before I actually became a feminist, um, California legalized abortion. They had the Therapeutic Abortion Act. But
right.
of course, I didn't know that, neither did anyone else. It was not publicized. And yeah, and doctors wouldn't do it. I mean, it was legal, but you had to find a doctor who would do it. That was the biggest part. It took me several weeks, to uh, find someone that was so hidden and not talked about. As far as getting into the women's movement, um, I was experiencing these things and reading about it. I had a friend that gave me a copy of Betty Friedan's book, and that was very inspiring to me. So I was heard about a now meeting that was being held, and this was in down the the big city. It was down at 8th and Vermont at a very large restaurant. And where they had banquets, banquet room for 100 people or so, and that's where the now meeting was held. Well, I was quite put off by this meeting. For one thing, uh, all the women were uh, professional women. They were there in their suits, and this was in '69, and who was I? I was just a little housewife, right? I felt very, like, what does this have to do with me?
Right.
None of their issues had anything to do with my life until they announced their committees. And when they came to the abortion committee, I realized, hey, now that I know about. And that I can really work on that one, because I was very outraged at, the bad experience that I'd had, and how hard it was to get it. So I joined the abortion committee. Turned out that there were only two other people on it. I was the third, yes. But what people? One was Lana Clark Phelan, who wrote the abortion handbook. She and Pat McGinnis worked up in Northern California. I mean, Pat was, I mean, she and Pat were leaders, and she was very knowledgeable and eloquent. So my role was to follow her around, because we were getting speaking engagements all over town. Groups were wanting to know, what is this about abortion? Why should it be legalized? What is it? Etc. So I was just at her feet, taking notes, learning about, the history of abortion and the politics of it. And the other member was Mary Petrinovich. And Mary was also active in the environmental movement. She was one of the organizers of the first Earth Day, which took place at that time. And she lived in Riverside, and she came into Los Angeles to, participate in the Now meeting on a monthly basis. And she brought with her women from the University of Riverside. Her husband was a professor. that needed abortions. And so she invited me over to this little illegal clinic on Santa Monica Boulevard. It was just a little storefront, kind of a shotgun approach. You walked in and there was a little office, and then you walked through the hall straight back, and there was where the clinic and the other utility rooms were.
Mhm.
And so, as they say, it may have only been 3 people, but wow, I without realizing it, I just plugged into the really major abortion setup in certainly in California, and maybe around the whole country. I think we were way ahead. I mean, New York was certainly ahead in terms of getting the law changed and women, flocking there from everywhere. But we had these very revolutionary things going on, namely this procedure that this abortionist had developed. He developed an early a handheld device. This handheld device consisted of a 50cc syringe. Can you see this?
Oh, now I can.
And this,
Right. Yeah.
yes, and this syringe was directly attached to a cannula. This is a plastic sort of straw-like tube, and it's got openings cut out here. He cut it out with he just took tubing and used a razor blade to make these little cuts that kind of makes it, when you pull it back, it sort of has a scraping surface.
Oh,
So instead of the DNC, which is what I had, which was the dilation and curettage, he was using this to, just directly suction out the material. And it worked safely and beautifully, much less painful. It was quite revolutionary.
wow.
And right, and now the man himself, I have to tell you, although he's a major figure in the movement and the abortion movement, he's famous, was kind of a male chauvinist pig. He was very handsome, charismatic kind of guy that, real cool in those days of cool, when everything was cool. And he was super cool. I didn't like him whatsoever, but I was very interested in his technique. And I became involved in the movement to demonstrations and so forth to support him, because he had been arrested and, he was on trial. It was always getting put off, but, he called himself Dr. Harvey Carmen. And he had been previously arrested when a woman died from an abortion. He was a UCLA college student. I don't think it was his fault particularly. Otherwise, they would have kept him in there forever. But he was there, for having been involved in it and doing it. So, that gave him some cachet right there, just his, arrest record. And the thing is that Mary referred all these people to him. And so he let us literally hang out. He didn't give us his attention or anything, but it was okay if we just sat in the white reception room and talked to women and ourselves, and then went through and helped sterilize, did little chores, and gradually, picked up the technology. Yeah, she said, Carol, why are we, out here promoting this guy when we can do this ourselves? It became clear that this was something that we could learn to do. and there were other women. I mean, like there were women in the movie industry there that you know, starlets, status people that would come and hang around at his clinic. It was just that whole scene, I guess, is what you'd want to call it. And so we started doing that, and that's when I would go. My husband was usually on the weekend. My husband would take the kids to the beach, and I would go to the clinic, as I say, just to hang out. And so we gradually got to the point where we felt, you know, that we needed more people, because at any given time there would be maybe 4 or 5 of us in the group, and it would be a constantly changing group. I mean, it was just, I mean, I think anybody who was active in the feminist movement at that time will know what I'm talking about. You know, things very loosey-goosey, you know, and that's how people liked it. And so we put a notice in the Every Woman's newspaper. That was a bookstore in, they had, the woman, Varda Murrell, had a bookstore there, feminist bookstore. And we said in this very vague little notice that we're going to get together and we're really going to solve these problems, or, you know, just some kind of vague, grandiose something that we said. Anyway, people got the message, and about 30 women showed up to our meeting.
Wow.
Well, so Mary and another woman, Cheryl, Libby, and I, we divided up what, you know, we were the jobs as to who was going to be the one to welcome everyone, etc. And my job was to explain this equipment. And so when I pulled it out and I started talking to the women in the group, it was just, I was losing them badly. They were just aghast, you know, because remember, women were dying of these backroom abortions, and you know, it was an ugly situation that we were all in. And here's this woman saying, and then you push through and pull this out. I didn't think some of them were going to get to the punchline because they were practically fainting. So I said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll show you. So then in this bookstore, which is a little Spanish style home, stucco house, there was a adjoining dining room. And I went over and there was a desk, because of course it was a bookstore. And they used, you know, Barda was using it for her business. Well, I happened to be wearing a long dress that night. So I went over to the desk and I lay back. And of course, I wasn't wearing underpants, so that didn't get in my. And I said, you know, I put in the, and, you know, and I thought, oh, I had no idea what was going to happen next. I just thought they were going to think I was an exhibitionist, you know, or this was a secret recruitment or, you know, some kind of weird stuff. Anyway, they didn't. They just rushed over, really, literally, and were utterly delighted and fascinated in looking at my cervix and full of questions. And, you know, and it just turned into this absolutely incredible experience and evening.
Wow.
And with yeah, I would say, you know, within the first half an hour, because I don't think I kept expecting them in much longer than that. It starts to kind of hurt being in a long time. We had covered so many bases. I mean, like women would say, have you had children? Oh, yes. And And I'd explain, the cervical os and so forth. And one woman said, well, I said, actually, I was imparting my knowledge, of course, to them. And I said, well, I have a tipped uterus, and that you can see that the body of the fundus of my uterus lies back, and it in my abdomen, and the cervix sort of tips up. And my doctor told me that that's why I got so easily pregnant. Well, the other woman in the room said, really? The doctor tipped uterus, and that's why I couldn't get pregnant. We all realized how much we'd been had by these doctors, just filling us full of nonsense, and it was just amazing that we would, have had this so-called knowledge, which was really just whatever happened to come in that doctor's mind, I guess. Anyway, talk about old doctor's tales. That's what we. So by the end of the evening, other women had volunteered to get up and do it. Like one woman said, "Oh, I'd really love to do it, but I'm on my period." And everybody said, "Oh, please." I mean, that's the first time anybody had ever thought our period was anything, to be welcome, and it was total change of thought.
Amazing.
So, yeah, by the end of the evening, we had planned to, meet the next week. We didn't want to wait a whole month. And also, women started thinking, well, gee, if this would work, what about if you put a little Q-tip in the opening? Would that maybe cause it irritate? They just started thinking. I mean, by the way, we never did that, but that was the kind of unleashing of feminine ingenuity. And of course, the main thing that we unleashed that evening, as it turns out, was Lorraine Rossman's inventiveness. She was one of the attendees. She had come in from Orange County, which was quite an hour's drive for this meeting. She showed up the next meeting with a device that looked something like this. And, what is this, And she said, well, this is based on that. She said, I don't, that's okay for an abortionist, that's trained and doing this all the time. But I don't like that because what if this material, instead of coming out, what if accidentally it got pushed forward and went back into the uterus? Mm-hmm. And if there was a perforation, it could get into the bloodstream and that would cause death. Mm-hmm. Well, that was a big concern. And no, Harvey had taken care of it because he had put little plastic sticks here, and they as he pulled this out, they just flared out and then braced against this.
Oh, I see.
So, yeah, it worked for him. Okay, but we all agreed with Lorraine that was just too insecure, for us to use. So what she did is that she added a collection jar for the material, because he would fill this up and then have to take it out and empty it and then re-put it back on, and it'd take him several pumps to take out a pregnancy, several syringefuls, so she added this collection jar and she put a tube leading from the cannula to take the material into that jar. And then she took another tube out of the jar. Well, it wasn't a metal, it was a plastic jar at the time. But anyway, out of this jar that would go over here. Well, the beauty of this is not only did it, make sure that could never be reversed by mistake, but it simplified the whole procedure tremendously because we, you just boil down to you needed one person to put in the cannula, make sure it didn't touch the sides, pick up any little germs as it went in, and then manipulate it. And or on the other side, you had someone to pump the syringe. So the skill level just went way, way down. That would be necessary. And then we would have a third person usually who would, be there and hold a woman's hand and guide her through the procedure because she couldn't always necessarily see what was happening. So we had a mirror there so she could look down and see the material traveling out of this tube and be part of the experience and also tell us if she felt any pain. And this was a huge component of the safety, was that she was, we used a very small cannula, so it wasn't as painful as what I had experienced, because at that time, I mean, this is a 4 millimeter, and most Harvey was using, was more like a 9 millimeter cannula. Yeah. Well, he put in a little local anesthesia. He put right on the face of the cervix. He would put a few shots there.
I see.
And just to deaden that. And that took care of that. And but we didn't even have to do that, you see, because this didn't cause that much pain. So we eliminated the dangers of anesthesia. We eliminated the dangers of perforation. And we simplified the skills so that less material get in, keep the infection down. Of course, a word about infection. This was, of course, one of the chief complications. It turned out from how a woman would get an infection. And here's where, being a friendship-based group, we didn't do this. By the way, just interrupt myself to say that right as we were doing this, abortion was becoming much more available in Los Angeles. And the whole reason for starting an illegal clinic on our part started to go away. So we completely shifted to self-help and menstrual extraction. So anyway, but back to infection, that's usually because it was an incomplete, that not everything was taken out. And so therefore, since the uterus is not a sterile cavity, there were always bacteria there, then infection would develop. So you just simply repeat the procedure and you suction out that fetid material. And you, of course, keep in touch with the woman for the next few days to make sure everything's fine. And it always was. That took care of it. So really, this is an outstanding, has proven to be a very, very safe procedure. And that was accomplished by that second meeting when Lorraine, it took her, another couple of months before she arrived at what type of jar, what size, etc., to get it all so it was functioning.
Well, tell me about then the self-help part of it, and you moved into that.
Well, as I say, the self-help clinic was just a very serendipitous kind of discovery. And it has proven to be a tremendous source of energy and creativity in the women's movement. I've had women come up to me and say, you changed my life. And they just really say it very sincerely and excitedly, they're delighted to share that. And they went on, I mean, they went on to do fantastic things. They went on to open up women's clinics after Roe v. Wade around the country. There was 30, you know, women-controlled abortion clinics around the country. They, pioneered in endometriosis. I mean, not that they've unfortunately been able to solve that problem, but people that were involved in self-help started the Endometriosis Association. It I'm just trying to think of all the different manifestations of self-help. I think the biggest response I got was or Lorraine and I got, was in Rhode Island, because it was cold. We went in the fall, in October, and it had gotten quite cold by that time. I was a California girl, and that was, for me, it was very cold. So when it came time to demonstrate to self-exam up on the stage, I took off my long johns. And that really just cracked everybody up in the whole place. That anybody would be such a namby-pamby, as me, with it was so cold. We didn't take ourselves too seriously.
Yeah.
But uh, we realized immediately. I mean, having spent these couple of years. I mean, the second wave had been taking on this issue, of abortion. Of course, I want to say this because I think it's very important for us to realize what brings about social change and what maybe doesn't. And that is that there was a real movement in this country to liberalize abortion at least 10 years prior. And so I don't think it's quite accurate to say that the second wave, made this happen. I mean, I know we kind of felt that way, but I don't think it did. But definitely it gave that oomph. It was the 1-2 punch, and it took it out of the professionals, because the movement that had existed was mostly clergymen and doctors, lawyers, and they were all committed to just the liberalization and heavy professionalistic and so forth. And even though Roe v. Wade said that abortion was between a woman and her doctor, it actually proved that it was the woman. And in actual fact, the doctors were never brought into the picture other than doing the procedure.
Right.
I mean, I think we can definitely claim that.
Right.
That we said no. This is our choice, and doctors step back.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So tell me what about menstrual extraction is. You mentioned that.
Well, we started doing menstrual extraction. Now that can be done whether you're pregnant or not. I mean, that's literally what it is, menstrual extraction. And of course, not only was this Lorraine's equipment, but she was also very, creative and deep thinking about the political ramifications of it. Because she felt that that this was just bringing on your period, whether whether you were pregnant or not,
Mm-hmm.
and to just get rid of that whole um, dividing line, and and that's what we've stuck to. We never do a pregnancy test. I mean, once you start doing the procedure, it is very obvious which one you're dealing with, because if you're just extracting a non-pregnant, menstrual period, it's very thick and gummy, menstrual material is like that, right? It's very dense. Um, and so it comes out of the tube very slowly. And then when it goes into the collection, we put it in a bowl of water, a big salad bowl of water that once it got in the water, it just would coil up like spaghetti, it got formed in the tubes.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were dealing with an early pregnancy, it came faster and easier. And it was kind of broken up between whitish or pinkish pieces of tissue and bloody material and water. And it was more watery.
Mm-hmm.
So, it wasn't hard to figure out that you were dealing with pregnancy.
Mm-hmm.
But we would not determine that in advance,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Well, I
And I
think
think that,
I think it's true through history that women just tried to bring on their menses, before we understood even, many biological issues. That's what they did. They brought on their menses whenever.
you're absolutely right, Judy. And we, honored that tradition and kept in it,
Mm-hmm.
to break down what seemed to us an artificial, um, what didn't relate to us. I mean, the experience of having a menstrual extraction is a world away from going to a clinic to get an abortion.
Mm-hmm.
They're totally different experiences. And in menstrual extraction, as you say, it's just
Oh,
taking care of you're making sure you have your period. You're doing it with friends, or at least friends of friends. You know these people,
mm-hmm.
and it's not medicated or anything. And usually, in fact, it's not very um, common that everybody'd have a nice glass of wine after they were finished with the procedure.
That's great. So when did you stop that activity? I mean, that was going on after Roe, right? Into the late 70s for sure.
Well, once it became possible, we um, started a clinic there, and we called it Women's Choice Clinic. Um, Now, I didn't have anything to do with that personally, because I had been arrested the previous fall in 72, Madisonville license. And I had, gone to trial. I did not elect to postpone it. You can postpone it once, you can postpone. But I said, no, we need to go to trial. And when I say that's kind of mischaracterization, because we did this all together. It was a joint activity and joint decisions. And so we decided to get it over with. And I was adjudged to be not guilty by the jury. Our attorney, Diane Wayne, um, who at that time was, a very new attorney, she and Jeanette Nolan. Um, and then later on, Diane became a very prominent and attorney, in fact, in the LA courts. She was one of the leading judges, and she always referred to what we call the yogurt trial as her, you know, her main case. So, um, and it's the reason we called it the yogurt trial. Is when they raided us, because a policewoman had come and um, pretended to attend the self-help clinic.
I see.
And actually, she wrote very mild. I mean, she did her job. I'm not going to say she didn't do her job, but she didn't add any lies or anything to it. But when they came to raid, that was a different story. And they went through and they took note that the kitchen sink was full of dishes, dirty dishes, that kind of anything to make us look stupid and
Right.
irresponsible. And they also appropriated the food out of the refrigerator. And because yogurt had been part of the what they had witnessed me doing was putting yogurt into someone's vagina.
Right.
So therefore, they took the yogurt, and that was and Debbie Law, who was there, she was a staff member at one of the self-helpers, and she said, "That's my lunch," The person who came to get yogurt put into her vagina was one of the regulars at the clinic. She was, I don't, this was before Roe v. Wade, of course, as I said. This is at the Women's Center. The Women's Center had moved on to the Venice, okay? That they found other quarters that they preferred. So we stayed and we kept the Women's Center there on Crenshaw Boulevard, and had the back room where we conducted our self-help clinics. And this particular time, this woman came with a group of teenagers that wanted to learn this. So we demonstrated self-exam and everything. Turned out, by the way, she was an ex-nun, and she was not prepared for what she saw, and she got very upset and reported it. What these women were doing. And so one of the women came to us and said, "Would you mind inserting this? I have a yeast condition, and I'll tell you who this is, Z. Budapest." Well, Z is very well known in the goddess movement, and she's considered herself a witch, and anyway, she's very, very colorful woman, and very powerful. And she was, part of our retinue. She wasn't actually on the staff. She didn't have a role, but she was their very welcome addition to our group, and a very charming person. So that was how the yogurt got into the picture. Was that G used it for her yeast condition. And yeah, so I had just been, and also Colleen Wilson, and she was a member of our staff. She was also arrested because she had, the policewoman had attended the self-help clinic that Colleen had conducted. And so Colleen at that time was just about ready to become certified as a teacher. She was in her educational process, and she said that just wasn't the time for her to be going to trial. So she plea bargained to one count of fitting a diaphragm. That was her crime. And she got summary probation. She didn't have to go to jail. And it just lasted a year, and automatically, was off.
Off her record.
So that,
yeah.
So I was the one that actually went to trial. And so therefore, this, was in December, and January was the Roe v. Wade decision, right? I took a couple of weeks off, and that's when it happened. That they legalized abortion. Of course, we were not surprised. A lot of people were surprised, but we were not. And the reason, and this is why I'm really, really I was telling you, I really want to talk about the current project that I'm involved in, is because it started at that time. I mean, this is stems directly from that time, is that this guy, Harvey Korman, was a population controller. he may have seemed like a little, you know, figure there, but in fact, he went to Bangladesh. Dr. Malcolm Potts was his good friend, and they went to Bangladesh and provided all these abortions to women that Harvey had invented with another procedure that was very bad and caused deaths and women to have their uteruses taken out and so forth. Yeah. And Germaine Greer was his friend when we went to the conference. And so he was up on a very high level and accepted within the population control movement, you know, and highly regarded, especially by the men, because they all admired his prowess with women, you know. Our very first encounter was with population control. And that gave us a window that other women didn't have. And we spread the word about it as much as about self-help. Unfortunately, the conservative aspect of our movement actually joined hands with the population control movement, you know, Planned Parenthood, you know. I mean, that is the official arm of the people who are anti-natalist, you know.
Really? Oh, I didn't get that connection with Planned Parenthood, really. Interesting.
Well, you wouldn't, Judy, because as I said, everybody was taken in by them. And they were considered to be the allies, and a lot of people went to work for them, became administrators. I mean, and why do you think the Black movement accuses us of being racist? I mean, how can they not, when we just so uncritically, you know, teamed up with people that were going around the world and giving, you know, dangerous methods of birth control to women of color.
Yeah.
I mean, they have a terrible, terrible, terrible track record, and have never been, even today, truly held to account for it. First harm is that they're out to solve the world's pollution problems and environmental problems by reducing the number of babies, number of people, instead of changing industrialization. You know, they work with Carnegie, Rockefeller, all that, DuPont, you know, the whole laundry list of industrialists is where their history is. And on the ground, in their actual clinics around the country, you know, they've put feminist clinics out of business. You know, just sheer competition. I mean, it's not even a political thing. It's a way they found to fund themselves. And, you know, they have engaged in a lot of unfair competition.
What's your project?
Well, I'm sitting right in the middle of it, okay? It is basically, let me show you this. Can you see this? I don't know.
Yeah.
This is a report, and can you see the pictures of the
Hold it
population?
up a little bit. The Feminist Women's Health Center, hold it up a little more so we can see the pictures. Yes, World Bank, AID, International Planned Parenthood. Okay, yeah, I see it.
Yeah. So, but this did not go over. I mean, the self-help movement was well received, but as I say, the more conservative parts of our movement were leery of what we were doing. And, you know, I have to say, we did not have the same success getting that message out. But that's my project. And of course, since I've been, you know, thanks to the pandemic, at home with all my books and reading and so forth, I have expanded my analysis from what we had. And I've come to realize that the patriarchy, and I know when I say the word the patriarchy, this kind of is the difference between the folks that I work with, because we believe that there is a patriarchy. And there are people who don't think that. They do think that there's some holdovers, and yes, they acknowledge that there's practices that are, obviously anti-woman and so forth. But the idea that we just are organized as our societies as a patriarchy strains their credulity. They just can't quite picture it. Well, I think we do have a patriarchy, and until we unravel it, we're not going to get very far on anything else, because it literally has. We didn't always have patriarchy. It developed in history. It has a beginning. Gerda Lerner very well researched it, and it took several thousand years to get entrenched.
But there we are. Yes.
Well, it didn't happen overnight, but it's very powerful, and men are as much victims of it as women, in the sense that they're, they get, just look at trans men, trans women, and how, they get murdered,
Yeah.
right?
Right. Absolutely.
So men are just as oppressed by this gender domination. Anyway, I found that population control has existed throughout patriarchy's history, that it's the main point of it, in fact. I found a book written in 1905. I have a copy here. And he, of course, it's not even in print anymore. His name is Stangeland, but he was an academic, and it's put out by one of the major universities, and quotes all very approved anthropological studies, etc., of the time, showing that marriage, for example, is maybe one of the first population control policies that states had in laws. And that the main point was to get women producing babies. It is to,
right,
on the most elementary level, to produce soldiers, and to do the, raise the babies. So that's where I'm starting. But believe me, it has taken me afield. Not only does it go back, but it is today their most popular population control policy is called neoliberalism. And this is an economic policy, and what it's done is to shift our wealth of our society up to the ruling class, right?
Right.
Basically. And it means that even so-called middle-class women can't even afford to have children.
Yeah.
Women today have to plan years in order to even have one child. And this was developed by, as a history. Of course, a lot of Foucault, the philosopher and historian, covers this part very well. He called it biopower.
So how do you think your involvement in before the second wave and during the second wave shaped your life?
It just set me on a whole different course. And as I told you, I feel this very deeply, and it is a very private kind of thing for me to think about, but it basically I got pushed. I mentioned that I had depression. I just kept on being this nice um, woman that was polite and was helpful and constructive and, involved in the community, etc. And I sank deeper and deeper and deeper into this depression until I was just in a very, very bad shape, very bad shape. And thank goodness at some point it clicked. One huge click that if I didn't take some action, I was going down. I could just picture myself, getting diabetes, and, you know, just, you know, being overwhelmed by all this. And I started fighting, and I came out fighting, and not all that wisely, necessarily. In fact, sometimes very unwisely, but it didn't matter. I knew that my very soul was at stake, and it still is today.
Hmm.
And when I say that I was going down, I became what later identified as being called a codependent. Remember, I said I kind of was disapproving of those women at UCLA. I'm very judgmental. I'd pick up the newspaper and read some terrible thing and say, gosh, how could that person do that? Some murder, be a mystery to me how anyone could ever be so in that. How could they set that huge fire? I think we've all had those feelings, at times. The click is that I got it. I got how normal, good people can, um, in desperation, if they're um, not allowed to thrive and grow and contribute in society, um, go the other way. I started joining these more radical organizations, but even in just on a personal life. I mean, like if I went to the market, if somebody cut in front of me, where before I would have just, oh, well, so what? Well, who cares? Oh, no. They had a battle royale. Okay. You're not going to cut in front of mine for me. That's what I'm saying. It didn't always take a positive thing. I just was downright abrasive. If anyone reads this and, uh, is anywhere in the situation that I was in, where they have finding themselves being judgmental, like today, people are against the right wing people. I'm not, you know, I'm not right wing. I used to be. I came over from it. I know where they're coming a lot. And I, I'm very concerned that now so many people are, who consider themselves liberals, are um, being very judgmental. And I just think that is something we have to avoid at all costs. We've got to understand why this fellow human being feels so strongly in a way that we don't identify with. So I'm still abrasive.